Well, on the line is Professor Tony Blakely, Professorial Fellow in Epidemiology at Melbourne University. He worked last year on the modelling with the state government on the restrictions in the second wave. Professor Blakely, good morning.
Good morning, Neil.
Well, 10 cases, that's quite good news, isn't it?
Oh, look, it's great. When your producer just told me on the phone now, that was fantastic. So, yeah, I'm reasonably hopeful. I don't want to say confident that we'll get through this without a lockdown, because the person who went to the MCG, as best I can tell, was 48 to 60 hours post their actual exposure or infection, and hopefully they weren't infectious at that point in time. The Craigieburn supermarket, that's a little bit concerning, because we've all got a bit slack with QR coding, so there might be somebody who got through there without scanning who's infected, which is a reminder to all of us at this point in time. Mask up, QR code.
So how long are you infectious with Delta? Is it any different? How long are you infectious after acquiring it?
Yeah. Well, it's actually not entirely clear, because we're trying to lock down on them so quickly that we get it over and done with. But there's no reason to believe that the total infectious period is any different from the old virus. It's just that you are so infectious that you become infective to other people quicker at day 2 or 3 sometimes. So the period of infection could well last for most people 10 to 14 days, but for some people could last up to 3 weeks. It is quite variable between individuals. But the key thing is how long from when you are exposed to when you become infected enough to infect others, and that can be quite quick.
Okay, so what's the 48 hour, the point you're making about the MCG? How does that fit into it?
Okay, so from what I can see, and I am not privy to any more information than other people reading the media, is that the removal people were in the apartment buildings on a Thursday, I think, and then the 60-year-old gentleman went to the MCG on the Saturday, which, assuming that was Saturday evening, that's about 48 to 60 hours. It would be unusual, but still could happen, that somebody would be infectious within 48 hours.
I see. That's that window we're talking about. Okay, so would you expect more cases still, though, even though we've got no fresh ones overnight, just the 10, it's a lot, 10 we're talking about yesterday, would you still think we'll see more cases?
I'm almost certain there'll be more cases. What I'm hoping, and every Victorian will be hoping the same, is that they're occurring amongst contacts of people who have already been identified, or perhaps a couple that pop up that then can be traced back to a contact site like the supermarket in Craigieburn or something like that, and we can quickly get our arms around it. Whether we need to go into a lockdown, I don't think they'll make that decision today based on this information. If they do, say some more cases pop up today which are occurring in amongst people that weren't in isolation, if we were to go into lockdown, I would pick it would be for 5 days, because that covers the average incubation period, that period from your exposure to averagely becoming infected or symptomatic. And that would be enough, I hope, to extinguish all chains of transmission. If we went earlier, things get worse, which is different from the New South Wales approach, of course.
So what do we look for? There will no doubt be more information coming through today, and there'll be more cases. What do we look for there to give us some indicator of what's ahead for us in terms of restrictions?
All right. The best scenario is as follows. If any cases that come up are only amongst the people who are already in isolation and they had not been in the community for a period when they were likely infectious, that's good. And if we've also got high testing rates, including around the potential contact sites, or they're all negative, that's really good. So that's the best case scenario. If 1, 2, 3 perhaps cases pop up where they weren't in isolation, they weren't known to be a contact, that does change the equation a bit, and it will depend on then looking at the data qualitatively as to how many places that person had been before you'd be ripping into a lockdown at that point.
Well, when talking lockdown, what about in between? I mean, the masks are back, which is a good thing. You agree with that. What about restricting, even just for the weekend or for 3 or 4 days, crowds at football, crowds in pubs, restaurants, that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's always tricky. It's very hard to know what the right judgment there is. If I was the Chief Health Officer, I would be doing a slightly New South Wales approach at this point and encouraging people to refrain from going out as much as possible. Given what we've just heard this morning, unless things get worse, I wouldn't be sort of mandating a closure of cafes and restaurants just yet. but certainly encouraging people to take every precaution. So when you're at the Bunnings queue, it's back to standing 1.5 metres away with a mask on. Everything that we can do with the least imposition on our business and society that will help stop the virus, do it now.
Yeah, and I think Victoria does have experience here because of what we've been through. There's more likely to be embraced and adopted than it was in New South Wales, you would think.
I would think so, but of course I'm not in New South Wales, so I'll be reluctant to be emphatic about that.
What do you, this situation we're talking about in the first half hour of the program about the removalists who apparently are still refusing to cooperate fully, did breach the rules when they came down. I've spoken to several people who saw them working without masks. There's one rule gone, quite apart from where they stopped and what they did. Some people are saying throw the book at them. Do you think that's appropriate?
Yes. I think this goes beyond the grey zone. So there's a grey zone where people might have, without thinking about it, done something against the rules, and we want those people to tell the contact traces everything. But these breaches of rules were so florid that there has to be consequences. The way that I would approach it myself is I'd be taking their company to task, not the individual drivers. I think it's important, if you really want to change people's behaviour, the trick is to work upstream on those levers. Sort of, we sometimes call them societal determinants, and here it's industry determinants. So you basically make the companies that employ these people responsible so that they take the responsibility and ensure their workers are doing the right thing. That's how I would approach it.
How do you encourage them to talk? Because they're still not telling us what happened. I mean, Michael O'Brien earlier says treat it like contempt of court. Put them in jail until they tell us what we want to know.
Yeah, I find that extraordinary. I don't even know what to say at that point, to be honest.
What you find the idea extraordinary, or the fact that they're not helping?
The fact that they're not helping, I find extraordinary. I'm sure they're embarrassed and probably feeling pretty shit about themselves and stuff, but they should be helping out in every which way they can at the moment, if only because any penalty they might incur individually would be lessened at that point.
Okay. Just quickly on AstraZeneca, it was suggested earlier this week, particularly to do with New South Wales, that if the when the cases were surging there, it was worth people considering bringing forward their second AstraZeneca shot. So bringing it forward to 2 months rather than 3. Are we in that stage in Victoria yet? Should people who've had one AstraZeneca shot be looking at bringing the second one forward? No, not yet, because there's good science behind those shifting dose frequencies depending on the risk around you. That's the number of cases. But we're not there yet in Victoria. And when you do make that type of decision, which is justified scientifically, it's damn hard to do the risk communication in a way that people can follow it simply. So I wouldn't rock the boat just yet in Victoria. However, in New South Wales, I think it's entirely appropriate. Finally, as we learn more about the Delta variant, we seem to become more and more worried by it. Is that appropriate, or are we overreacting to the Delta variant? No, it's a huge concern. You only have to look north of us up to some of the East Asian countries, which, like us, have been poster childs of an elimination strategy, and they're all struggling. I'm actually standing in Rotorua in New Zealand at the moment. I think New Zealand's got off very lightly with no incursions yet. They're the only ones still standing. We're struggling with it in Australia. It's really that slippery, and we've been modelling it, and you can see all the modelling results at pandemictradeoffs.com, and it really does change the situation. So even with an elimination strategy up to when we're all vaccinated, you see about 10 to 20% of the time in a state like Victoria would need to be spent in lockdown before we get high vaccination coverage, which is exactly what we're seeing at the moment. It is a tricky virus, and until we get the vaccination coverage up, we really can't relax that much. What's the mood like in New Zealand at the moment? Pretty good. Going into shops over here, a lot of people aren't QR scanning. So my New Zealand media, I'm trying to remind them what's happening in Australia, trying to encourage people to QR code scan when they go into shops. I think people don't quite realise how lucky they have been over here. But the other thing that is interesting at a political level, the discussion is pivoting quite dramatically to how do we learn to live with this virus. So New Zealand is pivoting away from its elimination stance, or at least getting ready to once the vaccination coverage is high. So that's a good discussion to see. Have they found any secret on how to get the vaccination higher? Well, actually this weekend doing a mass vaccination effort in South Auckland, which is a high-risk community, where they're just going to trial. It's so much more rational sometimes than what we do with state, federal, argy-bargy in Australia, yes. Where they're just going to, they're lining up all the GPs and the pharmacists, and they're doing a mass vaccination in South Auckland as a test. And if that works, then they'll
do mass vaccination weekends in other parts of the country as the vaccine comes in. So it seems to be happening quite calmly and rationally over here.
It often does. Thank you for speaking to us from New Zealand. Take your time. Thank you.
Righty, thanks, Neil. See you.
Professor Donny Blakely, Professorial Fellow Epidemiology at Melbourne University, been advising the state government. He's a Kiwi, I think, but he's in New Zealand at the moment. And he's right, you know. Every time I have a look at New Zealand, I think, gee, they've done this. You know, they were quick with a treaty. They were quick with same-sex marriage, a whole number of social things they did very quickly. And one of the reasons was they don't have this federation nonsense that leads to sort of political posturing we've been copying here between the state and federal government. He's right. He's right. What's happening in here at the moment should mean the end of the federation. But it won't.